Welcome, everyone, to Program Evaluations and Needs Assessment, using data to improve programs, demonstrate impact, and secure funding. Today, we're going to talk about something that can sometimes make nonprofit professionals uncomfortable: data. For some of us, the word evaluation immediately brings to mind spreadsheets, surveys, reports, performance measures, and one more thing we have to document. But I want us to look at evaluation differently today. Evaluation isn't simply something we do because a funder asks for a report. And data isn't just something we collect so we can put a number into a grant application. At its best, data tells us a story. It tells us who we're reaching. It tells us whether our programs are actually working. It helps us understand where we're making a difference. And just as importantly, where we may need to change course. And that's where needs assessment comes in. Before we can evaluate whether a program is effective, we need to understand the community we're serving. What are people experiencing? What barriers exist? What resources are missing? And perhaps most importantly, are we solving the problem our community actually needs us to solve? Today, we're going to connect these two ideas: needs assessment and program evaluation, and look at how they can work together. We'll explore how to collect meaningful information, move beyond simply counting participants, identify outcomes that actually matter, and turn what we learn into stronger programs. And we're also going to talk about something every nonprofit professional eventually has to answer. How do we prove that our work is making a difference? Because when we can answer that question with credible data, we don't just improve our programs, we strengthen our stories. We build trust with our communities. We demonstrate accountability to our partners and funders. And we become much better positioned to secure the resources needed to continue the work. So today isn't about becoming a data scientist. It's about becoming more intentional about the information you're already collecting and learning how to turn that information into insight, action, and impact. Before we move into today's conversation, we want to take a moment to ground ourselves in the community and history that surrounds the work we do. At Amity, we incorporate teachings that center the community before we begin our work. Today, we will use the LA County Land Acknowledgement to recognize the price paid by individuals that has resulted in efforts such as the Care First Community Investment. As we spend today's session talking about understanding communities, identifying needs, collecting information, and using data to improve the services we provide, it's important that we first recognize the communities whose histories and experiences are foundational to the places where we work. We recognize that we occupy land originally and still inhabited and cared for by the Tonva, Tataviam, Serrano, Quiche, and Chumash peoples. We honor and pay respect to their elders and descendants. We acknowledge that settler colonization resulted in the genocide of the First Peoples. This acknowledgement demonstrates our responsibility and commitment to truth, healing, and reconciliation, and to elevating the stories, culture, and community of the original inhabitants of Los Angeles County. As we move into today's session, I invite you to keep that spirit of community centered work with you. When we talk about needs assessments and program evaluation, we're not simply talking about numbers on a spreadsheet. We're talking about people, lived experiences, community priorities, and the responsibility we have to make sure the work we're doing is actually responding to what communities need. With that grounding, let's begin. Before we get into the technical side of program evaluation, I want to start with a little reality check. Because when we talk about data, I think a lot of nonprofit professionals have one of four reactions. Maybe you're thinking, we collect data because our funder requires it. Or maybe it's we track attendance, but honestly, we're not really sure what else we should be measuring. Maybe your organization has incredible stories. You know, the work is changing people's lives, you hear it directly from participants, but when someone asks you to prove that impact with data, you're not quite sure where to start. Or maybe you're on the complete opposite end of the spectrum. You're collecting surveys, attendance, demographics, outcomes, feedback forms, spreadsheets, and so much information that you aren't even sure what you're supposed to do with all of it. So take a moment and look at these four statements. Which one sounds like your organization right now? You can drop the number in the chat, use the reaction buttons, or simply make a mental note. And because it's a recorded webinar, make that mental note. But don't worry, there's no wrong answer. In fact, these four responses represent some of the most common challenges organizations face with evaluation. And that's exactly why we're here. Because the goal of today's conversation isn't to collect more data just for the sake of collecting it. The goal is to collect the right data, understand what it's telling us, and actually use it to make better decisions. By the end of today's session, I want you to look at evaluation differently, not as another reporting requirement, but as a tool for learning, improving, telling your story, and ultimately demonstrating why your work matters. So let's start there. Why are we actually trying to learn from the work we're already doing? So, why does evaluation actually matter? And I want to start by challenging one common idea. Evaluation is not just about proving that your program worked. Evaluation is about learning. Think about it. Every day, your organization is making decisions. Who are we serving? What do they need? What's working? What's not? Where should we invest more resources? What should we change? Evaluation gives us better information to make those decisions. First, it helps us understand community needs. Communities change. What people needed 2 years ago may not be what they need today. A good needs assessment helps us listen, identify gaps, and make sure we're responding to what is actually happening, not what we assume is happening. Second, evaluation helps us improve services. Maybe participants love one part of your program, but consistently struggle with another. That's not failure, that's information. It gives you an opportunity to adjust. Third, it helps you make informed decisions. Instead of saying, I think this is working, we can say, here's what the data is showing us. Fourth, it helps you demonstrate impact. And this is where evaluation becomes incredibly powerful. Your organization probably has stories that demonstrate the difference you're making. Evaluation gives you another way to tell that story with evidence behind it. And finally, evaluation can strengthen funding opportunities. Funders want to know that their investment is creating meaningful results. When you can clearly explain what you measured, what you learned and how you've used that information to improve your work, you're demonstrating something much more valuable than success. You're demonstrating that your organization is capable of learning, adapting, and delivering impact. So, throughout today's session, I want you to remember this. Evaluation isn't about proving you're perfect. It's about proving that you're paying attention. You're paying attention to your community. You're paying attention to your participants. You're paying attention to your results. And you're willing to use what you learn to make the work better. Before we go any further, I want to clear up a few misconceptions about evaluation. Because sometimes the word evaluation makes it sound like we're talking about a giant spreadsheet, a complicated research project, or something we only do because a funder told us. And I want everyone to understand that evaluation is much bigger than that. First, evaluation is not just collecting numbers. While numbers matter, numbers without context don't tell us very much. If I tell you that 500 people attended a program, that's a number. But what did they experience? Did they achieve something? Did their situation improve? What did they learn? What changed? The number tells us how many. Evaluation helps us understand what happened and why it matters. Second, evaluation is not only something funders ask for. Yes, funders want evidence, but your organization should want that information too. Imagine being able to look at your own data and say, this part of our program is working incredibly well. This part needs to change. And here's what our participants are telling us. That's not just compliance, that's organizational learning. Third, evaluation is not a way to prove perfection. Your program doesn't have to produce perfect results for evaluation to be valuable. In fact, sometimes the most important finding is that something didn't work the way we expected. That isn't necessarily a failure. That's information. The organizations that are willing to learn from what isn't working are often the organizations that become stronger over time. And finally, evaluation is not a one-time activity. You don't evaluate a program once, put the report in a folder, and never look at it again. Evaluation should be a cycle. Plan, collect, analyze, learn, adapt, and repeat. The real power comes when evaluation becomes part of your organization's culture. So, as we move through today's session, I want you to let go of the idea that evaluation is simply about proving that your program worked. Instead, think of evaluation as a conversation between your organization, your data, and your community. And the goal of that conversation isn't perfection. The goal is learning, improvement, and impact. So, if evaluation isn't just about collecting numbers or proving that we're successful, what is it actually about? At its core, evaluation is about learning. And I want you to think about evaluation as a conversation. 5 questions that help us understand what our program is really doing is first, what are we doing? It sounds simple, but it's important. What activities are we actually delivering? Are we providing the services we designed? Are we reaching the goals we originally set? Before we can understand impact, we have to understand implementation. Second, who are we reaching? Who is actually participating in the program? Who are we serving? And perhaps just as importantly, who are we not reaching? Maybe your program was designed for 100 people, but you're consistently reaching 60. That's not just an attendance number. That's a question worth investigating. Are there barriers? Is the program accessible? Is the outreach reaching the right people? Third, what is changing? This is where we move beyond activities and start talking about outcomes. Are participants gaining skills? Are behaviors changing? Are people accessing resources? Are conditions improving? The goal is to understand what difference the program is actually making. Fourth, how do we know? This is where evidence comes in. What information supports what we're saying? Maybe it's a survey response, interviews, administrative data, assessments, participant feedback, or program records. We're moving from we think this is working to here's what we're seeing and here's the evidence behind it. And finally, what will we do next? This may be the most important question of all, because data that doesn't lead to a decision is just information sitting in a spreadsheet. What did we learn? What needs to change? What should we continue? What should we stop? What should we do differently? That's where evaluation becomes useful. And I want you to notice something about these 5 questions. None of them asks us to be perfect. They're asking us to be curious. What are we doing? Who are we reaching? What's changing? How do we know? And what are we going to do about what we learned? That is evaluation at its best. Not a report we complete at the end of a program, but a learning process that helps us make the program better while we're doing the work. Now, here's where evaluation gets really powerful. When we stop thinking about data and stories are competing ways of communication impact and start seeing them as partners. Because data can tell us what happened, but stories help us understand why it mattered. Think about it this way. If I tell you that 85% of participants completed a program, you know something happened. That's important. But what if I tell you that one of those participants was a parent who came into the program struggling to find stable employment, completed the training, got connected to a job opportunity, and was able to provide more stability for their family? Now the number has meaning. The data gives us credibility. The story gives us connection, but we need both. A story by itself can be incredibly powerful, but one story doesn't necessarily tell us whether we're creating a broader pattern of impact. And data by itself can tell us that something is happening, but it doesn't always tell us what that experience actually meant to the person behind the number. So when we're evaluating our programs, we want to ask both questions. What happened? That's where our data comes in. Why did it matter? That's where our stories come in. And when those two things agree, something really powerful happens. Imagine telling a funder, we served 300 participants. 78% achieved their target outcome. And here's the story of what that change looked like for one participant. Now, you're not just reporting a statistic, you're showing the impact. That's the sweet spot. Data makes your story credible, and stories make your data memorable. So, as we move through today's session, I want you to think about both. Don't just ask, what numbers do we have? Ask, what do those numbers mean? And whose story is behind them? So, how are we going to turn all of this into something practical? Today, we're going to walk through a simple framework that takes us from understanding a community need all the way to communicating the impact of our work. And notice that we're not starting with evaluation, we're starting with the community. First, understanding community needs. Before we design a solution, we need to understand the problem. What are people experiencing? What barriers exist? What resources are missing? And what does the community itself say it needs? Second, designing effective programs. Once we understand the need, we can design a response that actually connects to it. We'll look at how programs can be built with clear goals, activities, and an intended outcomes. Third, measuring the success. Then we ask, What does success actually look like? Not just how many people walked through the door, but what changed because they did. Fourth, collecting meaningful data. This is where we get practical. What information should we collect? How do we collect it without overwhelming our staff or participants? And how do we make sure the data we're gathering actually answers the questions we care about? Fifth, using findings for improvement. Because collecting data isn't the finish line. We need to use what we learn. Maybe we change a service. Maybe we adjust our outreach. Maybe we discover that something is working better than expected and decide to invest more in it. That's where evaluation becomes a management tool, not just a reporting requirement. And finally, sharing your impact. You've done the work, you've collected the information, you've learned from it. Now, how do you communicate that impact to your community, your partners, your board, your funders? And this brings us back to something we talked about earlier. Data tells us what happened, and stories tell us why it mattered. So think of today's framework as a cycle, not a straight line. Listen to the community, design with intention, measure what matters, learn from the evidence, improve the work, and tell the story of the impact. That's the journey we're going to take together today. So, before we move into the next section, I want us to slow down for just a moment. We've talked a lot about data evaluation and understanding community needs. But sometimes the most valuable data begins with a simple question. What don't we know? So I want you to think about your organization and your own community. What is one thing you wish you knew more about? Maybe you want to understand what challenges your participants are actually facing outside of your program. Maybe you know that some people aren't accessing your services, but you don't know why. Maybe your community has resources available, but people don't know how to access them. Or maybe there are barriers that your organization hasn't fully identified yet. Take a moment and write down one question. And notice that I said question, not answer. We're not trying to solve the problem yet. We're identifying what we need to learn because that is where a meaningful needs assessment begins. Sometimes organizations jump straight into solutions. We need another program. We need another workshop. We need more staff. But what if we paused first and asked, what does the community actually need? And how do we know? That question can completely change the way we design our programs. So hold on to that question you just wrote down. As we move through today's session, I want you to think about how you can actually answer it using information from your community. Because great evaluation doesn't begin with a spreadsheet, it begins with curiosity. So we've identified the questions we want to answer. Now let's talk about the tool that helps us begin answering them, the needs assessment. At its simplest, a needs assessment is about one thing, listening before leading. And I really want to emphasize those words, listening before leading. Because as organizations, we often have good intentions. We see a problem and immediately think about the solution. We think we should create a workshop. We need a new program. We should offer this service. But there's a step that needs to come before the solution, understanding. A needs assessment is the process of gathering information to understand three things. First, what does the community need? What challenges are people experiencing? What priorities do they have? What are they telling us? Second, what resources already exist? Because sometimes the answer isn't creating something new. Maybe there's already a great organization providing the service, but people don't know about it. They can't access it, or there's a gap in coordination. And third, where are the gaps? Where does the need exceed the available resources? Who is being left out? What barriers are preventing people from accessing what's already available? The last question is especially important because a community doesn't necessarily need another program. Sometimes it needs better access to an existing program. Sometimes it needs transportation. Sometimes it needs language access. Sometimes it just needs trust. A needs assessment helps us discover the difference between what we assume a community needs and what the community is actually telling us it needs. And that's why I love the phrase listening before leading, because the best programs don't begin with, here is what we're going to do. They begin with, tell us what you're experiencing, tell us what's missing, tell us what would make a difference. Then we build from there. That's the foundation of a truly community informed program. So, why does a needs assessment matter so much? Because good intentions don't automatically create good programs. An organization can have passionate staff, strong partnerships, and the resources to launch something and still miss the mark if we haven't taken the time to understand the problem we're actually trying to solve. Without a needs assessment, we risk solving the wrong problem. We might see one issue on the surface and assume that's the root cause. But once we listen to participants and look at the data, we may discover that the real barrier is something completely different. We also risk duplicating existing services. Maybe another organization is already providing exactly what we were preparing to build. Instead of creating another program, our role might be to partner, fill a gap, or help people connect to that existing resource. Third, we risk missing underserved populations. The people who are easiest to reach aren't necessarily the people with the greatest need. If we're only listening to the people who already participate in our programs, we may never hear from the people who aren't accessing them. And those voices can tell us a lot about the barriers we're missing. Then there's time and resources. Nonprofits are already operating with limited capacity. We can't afford to spend months developing a program that doesn't address the actual need. And finally, we risk designing programs people don't use. And that's one of the hardest lessons an organization can learn. You can build something with the best intentions. You can have a beautiful program model, a great flyer, and an entire implementation plan, and still have low participation because the program doesn't fit people's actual lives. Maybe the time doesn't work. Maybe transportation is the barrier. Maybe the location isn't accessible. Maybe the service doesn't address the priority people actually have. A needs assessment helps us discover those things before we invest heavily in the solution. So, here's the bigger takeaway. A needs assessment isn't about slowing your organization down. It's about preventing you from moving quickly in the wrong direction. The goal isn't to build the program we think people need. The goal is to understand what people need and then build with them, not simply for them. Here's a distinction I want us to pay very close attention to: assumptions versus evidence. Every organization makes assumptions. It's human. We work closely with our communities, we hear stories, we see patterns, and over time we develop a sense of what we think is happening. The problem isn't having assumptions. The problem is making important decisions based on assumptions without testing them. For example, we might say, we know what our community needs, but do we? Have we actually asked them? Have we looked at current data? And have we talked to people who aren't accessing our services? Or maybe participation is low and we assume people simply don't care. But what if the real issue is the transportation, scheduling, childcare, language access, the trust? Suddenly, the problem and therefore the solution looks very different. We might also assume there aren't enough resources in our community, but a needs assessment might reveal that resources actually exist. The real gap may be awareness, accessibility, eligibility, or coordination. And here's one of the most common assumptions: our program must be working because people keep coming back. That's encouraging, but repeat participation alone doesn't prove impact. Evidence asks us to go one step further. What changed because of the program? That's the shift we're trying to make today. Don't replace your professional judgment, strengthen it with evidence. Your experience matters. Your staff expertise matters. Your community relationships matter. But when we combine those things with credible evidence, we make better decisions. The goal isn't to eliminate assumptions, it's to test them. Because the moment we move from we think to we know because, that's when evaluation becomes powerful. So we've established that we don't want to rely on assumptions. The next question is, where do we actually get the evidence? And here's the good news. Your organization probably has access to far more information than you realize. We often think that collecting data means creating a complicated survey or hiring an outside evaluator. It doesn't have to be. Your community is already generating information every single day. Our job is to know where to look and how to listen. We can start directly with the people we serve through surveys, interviews, focus groups. A survey might help you identify patterns across hundreds of participants. An interview can help you understand the experience behind those numbers, and a focus group can reveal perspectives that you might never uncover through a checkbox. Then there are community meetings and listening sessions. Sometimes the most valuable information comes from simply creating a space where people can tell you what's happening in their lives and what they believe is missing. But community voice is only one piece of the puzzle. We can also look at existing sources like census data, schools, local health departments, and other public agencies. These sources can help us understand broader patterns in things like demographics, education, health, employment, housing, and other community conditions. And don't overlook your partner organizations. A school may see a trend you're not seeing. A healthcare provider may understand a barrier your program hasn't identified. Another nonprofit may have already gathered the data that helps complete the picture. And finally, observation. Sometimes we're so focused on collecting formal data that we forget to pay attention to what's happening right in front of us. What do staff see? What do participants experience when they walk through the door? Where do people get stuck? What questions do they repeatedly ask? Those observations can become important evaluation questions. And here's the key: you don't need to use every source. The goal is to choose the right sources for the question you're trying to answer. If you want to know how many, quantitative data may help us. If we want to understand why, qualitative information may be more useful. And when we bring different sources together, we get something even stronger, a fuller picture of the community. Because the best needs assessment doesn't just collect more information, they collect different perspectives that help us see the whole story. So let's talk about the power of asking better questions. Sometimes the question we ask determines the quality of the information we get back. Instead of simply asking, "Do you need help?" which can lead to a yes or no, try asking, "What are the biggest challenges you're facing right now?" The same applies to program planning. Rather than asking, "Would you attend a financial literacy workshop?" ask, "What topics would be most helpful and what would make it easier for you to attend?" The goal is to move from yes or no answers to questions that uncover real needs, barriers, and opportunities. So let's have a little fun with this one. Imagine you attend a workshop and at the end you get this survey question. How amazing was today's life-changing workshop? And your only responses are amazing, very amazing, or extremely amazing. Clearly, we've already decided what your answer should be, right? So while this is a funny example, it highlights a real problem with survey design, leading questions. When we use language that assumes people had a positive experience, we're not really collecting honest feedback. We're influencing the response. Instead, we could simply ask, how would you rate today's workshop? And provide a range of responses from very dissatisfied to very satisfied along with an option for additional comments. The goal isn't to create a survey that tells us what we want to hear. It's to create a survey that helps us understand what people actually experienced. And sometimes the most valuable feedback is the feedback we may not want to hear because that's what helps us improve. Now, let's put all of this into a real world example. Let's say a community identifies a concern. Young people don't have enough safe spaces to go to after school. Instead of immediately creating a program based on assumptions, the organization conducts a needs assessment, and the findings tell us something more specific. Youth are facing transportation barriers. They want sports and creative activities. They're interested in exploration, and parents are asking for homework support. Now we have information we can actually act on. So the organization responds by expanding activities, adjusting schedules to better fit families' needs, and partnering with local schools. That's the power of a needs assessment. The community concern gives us a starting point, but the data and community input help us determine what the response should actually look like. The takeaway is simple. Don't just respond to what you think the community needs. Ask, listen, and let the findings guide the program. Let's bring this back to your own work. I want you to pause for a moment and think about a program, service, or community you're currently working with. Ask yourself, who are we actually trying to serve? Then, what do we already know about their needs? Not what we think we know, but what do we have evidence for? Next, consider what assumptions might we be making? Maybe we've assumed we know what people want, what barriers they face, or what would make them participate. And finally, ask the question that sometimes can be the most revealing. Who have we not asked yet? Because sometimes the biggest gap in our needs assessment isn't a lack of data, it's a missing voice. So take a pause the video if you have to, take a couple of minutes, and write down whatever comes to mind. Again, you're not looking for perfect answers, you're identifying where you may need to listen more. So let's talk about some of the common mistakes that can get in the way of good information. First, asking leading questions. If we've already decided what answer we want, we're not really assessing the need. Second, only only surveying current participants. Their perspective is important, but what about the people who aren't participating? Their barriers and experiences may tell us something completely different. Third, collecting data but never using it. Data should lead to a conversation, a decision, or an action. We also want to avoid ignoring community feedback just because it doesn't match what we expected to hear. And finally, remember that one solution rarely works for everyone. Different groups may have different barriers, priorities, and experiences. When we avoid these pitfalls, needs assessments become much more powerful. They help us understand our community, identify gaps, prioritize resources, design programs that are actually relevant, and build stronger fundraising proposals. Ultimately, a good needs assessment helps us move from We think this is what we people need, to here's what the community told us they need, and here's what we're going to do about it. So we've done the hard work, we've identified a need, we've listened to the community, we designed a program, we put the program into action, but now comes the question that really matters. How do we know if it's actually making a difference? It's easy to measure what we did, but how many workshops we held, how many people attended, or how many resources we provided. But evaluation asks us to go one step further. Did anything change? Did the participants benefit? What worked? What didn't? And what should we do differently moving forward? That's where program evaluation comes in because launching a program isn't the finish line. It's the beginning of learning whether our approach is actually creating the impact we hoped for. Now that we've talked about understanding community needs, let's shift to the next question. How do we know if our program is actually working? That's where program evaluation comes in. Program evaluation is simply a systematic way of collecting information to understand what happened and what impact we had. We're asking four key questions. Did we do what we planned? Who did we actually reach? Did participants benefit? And what can we improve? Notice that last question. Evaluation isn't just about proving that a program was successful. It's also about learning. Maybe you reached fewer people than expected. Maybe participants loved one part of your program, but didn't find another part useful. That information is valuable. Evaluation helps us move from we think this is working to here's what the evidence is telling us. Now, I want to shift how we think about the word evaluation. For some organizations, evaluation can feel intimidating. It can sound like someone is coming in to determine what went wrong or who is responsible. But that's not the purpose of good evaluation. Evaluation isn't about judgment, it's about learning. Instead of asking, who do we blame? We want to ask, what can we learn from this? Maybe an activity didn't get the participation you expected. Maybe your outreach strategy wasn't effective. Maybe participants needed something different than you anticipated. Again, those aren't failures, they're information. The strongest organizations use evaluation to make better decisions, improve their programs, and respond to what their communities are telling them. So when you think about evaluation, think less about proving and more about improving. Here's an important distinction when we talk about evaluation. Outputs are not the same as outcomes. An output tells us what you did. For example, we held 12 financial literacy workshops. That tells us the activity happened, but it doesn't tell us whether it made a difference. An outcome tells us what changed as a result. In this example, 85% of participants increased their financial knowledge. So, 12 workshops is the activity. Increased financial knowledge is the result. And that distinction matters because we can deliver a program exactly as planned and still not achieve the change we were hoping for. When evaluating your own program, ask yourself, are we measuring what we did or are we measuring what changed? Because ultimately, it's the change that tells us whether our work is making an impact. Let's put this into practice. I'm going to give you a few examples, and I want you to think about one question. Are you describing what you did or what changed? First, 350 youth attended programs. Output or outcome? That's an output. It tells us how many people were reached. Next, 42 workshops delivered. Also an output. It tells us what you provided. Now let's look at the outcomes. Youth confidence increased. That's an outcome because Something changed for participants. Parents reported stronger family communication. Outcome, because we're seeing a change beyond simply participating in the program. And finally, participants gained employment. Definitely an outcome. It demonstrates a meaningful result that occurred after participation. So remember the simple distinction. Outputs equal what you did, outcomes equal what changed. And when we evaluate our programs, we want to capture both because knowing what was delivered is important, but knowing what differences made is even more powerful. Now, let's connect everything we've talked about into one simple framework, the logic model. Think of it as the story of how your program creates change. It starts with the need. What program are you trying to address? From there, you identify the activities. What are we actually going to do? Those activities produce outputs, the workshops delivered, the people served, the resources provided. But you don't stop there. We want to know what happens next. Our short term outcomes. What changes do we see in participants right away? Over time, those can lead to long term outcomes, more sustained changes in behavior, knowledge, skills, or circumstances. And ultimately, we're working toward community impact, the bigger change we want to see in the community. So the logic model helps you connect the dots. Here's the need, here's what you're doing, here's what you're producing, here's what's changing, and here's the impact you hope to create. That connection is what makes a program easier to plan, evaluate, and improve. Let's make the logic model a little more concentrate with an example. Imagine a community is experiencing high youth unemployment. That's your need. So the organization responds with resume workshops. That's the activity. What you're doing to address the need. We then track your output. 200 youth attended. That tells us how many people we reached. But remember, attendance doesn't alone tell us if the program worked. So we look for the outcome. 85% of participants improve their resumes. Now we're seeing an actual change. Then we look further down the road. Our long term outcome is that 40 youth obtained employment. And ultimately, we're working toward a broader community impact, greater economic stability. Notice how each step connects to the next need, activity, output, outcome, long term change, impact. That's the power of a logic model. It helps tell the complete story of how our work is intended to create meaningful change. Now that we understand the difference between outputs and outcomes, let's talk about how to make our outcomes stronger and easier to evaluate. One helpful framework is SMART, specific, measurable, achievable, relevant, and time bound. Think about the difference between saying participants improved, improved what, by how much, and when. That's where a SMART outcome gives us much more clarity. Instead, you could say 80% of participants increased their budgeting knowledge by 20% after completing 4 workshops. Now we know who, what, how much, and when. The goal isn't to make your outcomes complicated. It's to make them clear enough that you can actually measure whether change occurred. So when you write an outcome, ask yourself, could someone look at this statement and clearly tell whether you achieved it or not? So once we have a clear outcome, the next question is, how will we know if change actually happened? That's where indicators come in. Indicators are the things we measure to give us evidence that progress or change is happening. For example, if your goal is to improve financial stability, you might look at income or savings. If we're working with youth, we might look at school attendance, confidence, employment. Where we can also look at things like attendance and completion to understand whether people are participating and staying engaged. The key is to make sure your indicators correctly connect to the outcome that you're trying to measure. So don't just measure something because it's easy to count. Ask yourself, what would I actually expect to see if this program is working? That answer can help you choose the right indicators. Here's another important reminder when it comes to data collection. More data does not automatically mean better data. Sometimes we collect information simply because we've always collected it. But if we can't explain what we're going to do with that information, we should ask ourselves whether we really need it. Instead, ask, how will we use this information? Will it help us improve the program? Will it help us make a decision? Understand our participants? Demonstrate an outcome? If the answer is no, it may not be data you need to collect. The goal isn't to collect everything. The goal is to collect the right information. Information that helps you learn, make decisions, and ultimately serve your communities better. So let's take a moment to apply this to your own work. Think about one program or service your organization provides. Now, complete this sentence. We know our program is successful because. What would you say? Maybe it's because participants gained new skills. Maybe people found employment, improved their housing stability, became more confident, or stayed engaged in school. The important part is to move beyond. We know it's successful because people showed up. Ask yourself, what changed because of the program? Take a couple of minutes to write down your answer. And if you find yourself struggling to complete the sentence, that's useful information too. It may mean your program has an opportunity to get clearer about what success actually looks like and how you're going to measure it. So let's take that idea one step further. Collect with purpose. There's a quote that says, not everything that can be counted counts. And not everything that counts can be counted. And that's really important when we're collecting information from the people we serve. Before adding another question to a survey, another form, or another tracking requirement, pause and ask four things. Why am I collecting this? Who is actually going to use it? What decision will this information help you make? And finally, is it worth the participants' time to provide it? Because every question you ask takes time and effort from the people you serve. Good evaluation isn't about collecting the most data. Again, it's about collecting information that has a purpose. If we can't explain why we need the information or what you'll do with it, that may be a sign that you don't need to collect it at all. So, we've talked about collecting data with purpose, but what actually makes data meaningful? Meaningful data is information that helps you do something with it. It can help you improve your programs by showing what's working and what needs to change. It can help you make better decisions instead of relying on assumptions. It can help you tell your story impact, not just what you did, but the difference your work made. It also can help you meet grant requirements and demonstrate that you're achieving the outcomes you promised. And ultimately, all of this leads back to the most important reason, better serving participants. So when you're looking at the data your organization collects, ask yourself, is this information helping us understand, decide, improve, or communicate? If it is, you're probably collecting data that matters. Now, Let's look at two different types of data that can help you understand your programs: quantitative and qualitative data. Quantitative data is the numbers. It gives us things we can count and measure, like attendance, percentages, completion rates, or survey scores. Qualitative data gives you the story behind the numbers. It helps understand people's experiences through things like quotes, testimonies, interviews, and observations. Think about it this way: quantitative data might tell you 85% of participants improved their budgeting knowledge. But qualitative data might tell you why that improvement mattered. Perhaps a participant says, I finally feel confident enough to create a budget for my family. One tells us what happened, the other tells you what that experience was like. And it helps you understand that. And when you bring both together, you get a much fuller picture of your program's impact. Now that we know the difference between quantitative and qualitative data, the next question is, how do we actually collect it? The answer depends on what you're trying to learn. If you need numbers like how many people participated, how much knowledge increased, or how satisfied participants were, a survey or tracking form might be the right choice. But if you want to understand someone's experience, barriers, or perspective, you may need an interview, focus group, or open ended question. And sometimes the best approach is to use both. The key is not to choose a method simply because it's familiar or easy. Start with the question you're trying to answer and then go backward. What do you need to know? What information will decide that question? And what's the best way to collect it? When the method matches the question, the data becomes much more useful. So let's come back to something we talked about earlier, the power of the question. A simple question can give you very limited answers, or it can give you information that you actually use. Instead of asking, did you enjoy today's workshop? We could ask, what is one thing you learned today that you plan to use? Now you're learning about takeaways and potential application, not just whether someone liked the workshop. And instead of asking, was the facilitator good? Try asking, what could have made today's session more useful for you? That question creates space for honest feedback and gives you something you can actually improve. So when you're designing surveys or gathering feedback, think beyond, did you like this? Ask questions that help you understand what people learned, experienced, needed, and would change. Because better questions lead to better data, and better data leads to better decisions. Before you move on, there's one piece of data collection we can't overlook: ethics. When people share their information with us, they're trusting us to handle it responsibly. That starts with being transparent. Explain why you're collecting the information and how it will be used. Then, protect confidentiality and privacy. Participants should feel safe sharing information with your organization. We also want to collect only what we truly need. Just because we can ask for information doesn't mean you should. And finally, make sure that information is stored securely and accessed only by the people who need it. The bottom line is simple. Good data collection should never come at the expense of participant trust. When people trust you with their information, protecting that trust is just as important as collecting the data itself. Now, even if you're collecting the right information, you still have to ask, can we trust the data? Good data should be accurate. It reflects what actually happened. It should be complete, so we're not making decisions based on major gaps. It should be consistent, meaning that you're collecting and recording information the same way over time. It should be timely because outdated information may take longer to help you make good decisions. And finally, it should be organized so you can actually find it, understand it, and use it. Think about it this way: bad data can lead to bad decisions. If your attendance numbers are inaccurate, your conclusions about engagement may be incorrect. If information is missing or inconsistent, you may misunderstand what's happening. So data quality isn't just an administrative task. It directly affects the quality of the decisions you make and the services you provide. So now let's talk about what we actually do with the data once we have it, because numbers are important. Numbers alone don't always inspire action. If I simply tell you we served 500 people, you know the reach, but you don't really know the impact. Now listen to how different this sounds. We served 500 community members. 88% reported increased confidence accessing local resources. And one participant shared, for the first time, I felt like someone truly listened to me. Now we have both sides of the story. The number gives you evidence, the participant's experience gives that evidence meaning. That's why we want to give quantitative and qualitative data together. Numbers help demonstrate impact, stories help you understand it. Together, they build confidence in the work you're doing. And when we're communicating with funders, partners, leaders, or the community, that combination can make your impact much more powerful. Now it's your turn to put all of this together. Think about one program or service your organization provides. It can be something you're currently evaluating or something you've never formally evaluated before. And start with the first question. What change do you hope to see? Maybe participants gain knowledge, increase confidence, find employment, improve their housing stability, or develop a new skill. Next, how will you know that change actually happened? What would you be able to observe or measure? And finally, what information should we collect? Think about the data that would give you evidence, not just more information for the sake of having it. Take a few minutes to complete this with the three prompts. As you do, remember the connection that we've been building throughout this webinar. What we want to learn should determine what you measure, and what you measure should definitely help you make better decisions. So, as we wrap up, let's bring everything together into five simple takeaways. First, collect with purpose. Don't collect data just because you always have. Know why you need it and how you'll use it. Second, ask better questions. The quality of the question often determines the quality of the information you receive. Third, protect participant trust. People are sharing their experiences and information with you. You have a responsibility to respect their privacy and handle that information carefully. Fourth, combine numbers with stories. Numbers show you the scale and evidence. Stories help understand the human evidence behind those numbers. And finally, use data to improve, not just report. Evaluation shouldn't simply produce another report that sits on the shelf. It should help make better decisions. It should strengthen your programs and ultimately better serve the people in your communities. So if you remember just one theme from today, remember this. Good evaluation isn't about collecting more data. It's about asking better questions, learning from what you discover, and using that knowledge to create better outcomes. So let's imagine for a moment that it's grant reporting season. Your funder comes back with four simple questions. What changed? How do you know? What improvements did you make? And what impact did your funding have? Now, here's the real question. Would you have the answers? Not just the number of people you served, not just how many workshops you held. Could you show what actually changed for participants? Could you explain what the data told you? Could you point to a program improvement you made because of what you learned? That's where evaluation becomes more than a reporting requirement. When you collect the right data throughout the life of a program, grant reporting becomes much easier because you're not scrambling to create a story at the end. You've been documenting the story all along. And that's the shift we want you to make from collecting data for compliance to using data to make decisions, demonstrate impact, and strengthen future funding opportunities. Here's a simple way to think about evaluation. Good evaluation should help you answer three questions. First, what happened? Did we reach the people we intended to reach? Did participants experience the change we were hoping for? Second, why did it happen? What worked? What didn't? Were there barriers, challenges, factors? And finally, what are we going to do next? This is where evaluation becomes useful. We take what we learned and decide whether we need to continue, improve, change, or even stop something. So, evaluation isn't just looking backward at what happened, it's a tool for looking forward. What happened? Why did it happen? And what will we do differently because of what we learned? Here's something important to remember when it comes to funders. Again, they do not expect your program to be perfect. What they want to see is that you're paying attention, learning from your experience, and responding to what the data tells you. An organization can say, we listened. We paid attention to what participants in the community were telling us. We adapted. We made changes when something wasn't working or when needs changed. And we improved. We used what we learned to make the program stronger. That actually tells a much more compelling story than simply saying everything went perfectly because real programs serve real people and real communities change. So don't be afraid to talk about what didn't work. Show what you learned, what you changed, and how those changes made the program better. That's what a learning organization looks like. Let's look at the difference between reporting numbers and telling the story behind the numbers. A report might simply say we served 200 participants. That tells us what happened, but not much more. A stronger report gives you context, evidence, and action. We served 200 participants, exceeded our enrollment goal by 15%. Pre and post assessments showed a 32% increase in financial knowledge. Participants consistently requested additional budgeting workshops, leading us to expand our curriculum for the upcoming program cycle. Now we know what happened, what changed, what participants told us, and what we did because of it. That's a much stronger impact story. So when you're reporting to a funder, don't just give them the number. Give them the story behind the number. Show them the result explain what you learned, and most importantly, show how that learning influenced your next decision. That's how data moves from a report to a compelling story of impact. One of the biggest mistakes organizations can make is treating evaluation as a one-person job. Evaluation isn't just the responsibility of the person collecting the data or writing the grant report. It belongs to everybody. Program staff see what's happening on the ground. Case managers hear directly from participants. Volunteers notice things that staff may not see. Leadership uses the information to make decisions. And participants and community partners can tell whether the program is actually meeting the needs intended to address. Everyone has different perspectives. Are those perspectives making your evaluation stronger? Creating a culture of evaluation means that you need to think of data as something you have to turn in and start thinking of it as something we use to learn together. When everyone understands their role, evaluation becomes part of the program, not something that you're able to scramble to do at the end. So let's bring it back to a real world purpose again, using what we learn to make changes. Imagine your survey reveals something important. Participants are struggling with transportation. Now the data has given you an opportunity to respond. Maybe you adjust your program hours so participants have more flexibility. Maybe you add virtual options for people who can't easily travel. You can partner with transportation providers or offer practical support like gas cards or bus passes. None of these changes necessarily require completely redesigning your program. However, small changes can remove major barriers. And that's why evaluation matters. We're not collecting information just to put it on a report. We're collecting it so we can listen, respond, and make the experience better for the people that you serve. The data tells you where the opportunity is, but what we do with it is where the impact happens. So let's turn everything that we've discussed into action. I want you to leave this webinar with a simple evaluation plan you can actually use. Start by identifying one program. Don't try evaluating everything at once. Next, identify one desired outcome. What is the change you actually want to see? Then ask, how will we measure success? What information will tell you whether that change happened? And the fourth step is one that's easy to overlook. Assign responsibility. Who is actually going to collect, review, and manage this information? And finally, schedule time to review your findings because data sitting in a spreadsheet doesn't create change. Someone has to look at it, discuss what it means, and decide what to do next. So keep it simple. One program, one outcome, one measurement, strategy, one person responsible, and one time to review. That's how you turn evaluation from an idea into a practice. And as we close, I want to leave you with 5 simple words: listen, measure, learn, improve, repeat. Listen to your participants in your community. Measure what matters. Learn from what the data tells you. Improve your programs based on what you discover. And then repeat the process because evaluation isn't a one-time event. It's a continuous cycle of listening, learning, and getting better. The goal isn't to build a perfect program overnight. The goal is to build a program that keeps listening, keeps learning, and keeps improving. And when we do that, we're not just collecting data, We're using it to create better programs, stronger outcomes, and greater impact for the communities that you serve. So, again, listen, measure, learn, improve, repeat. That brings us to the end of our time together. Thank you for taking the time to learn, reflect, and think about how evaluation can strengthen the work you're already doing. If you have questions, want to discuss through an evaluation challenge, or need additional technical assistance, we're always here to support you. You can reach us at TPA at amityfdn.org. Thank you again for your time and for the work you're doing in your communities. We appreciate you being here. Have a great day. Bye.